Ethan's day began like any other, the hum of his tools filling the small workshop attached to his home. The quiet countryside outside Albuquerque had always suited him, offering solitude and a chance to work with his hands. Yet, as the sun began to dip, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, his routine shattered with the sound of something descending from the heavens. He stepped outside, shielding his eyes from a brilliant beam of light cutting through the clouds. A sleek, silver ship hovered above his property, its crystalline hull reflecting the fading sunlight. Before he could react, a hatch slid open, and a figure emerged, bound and silent. She stepped down the ramp, each movement fluid, yet restrained. Her silver hair caught the light like strands of liquid metal, and her eyes, violet and piercing, locked on him with a mixture of defiance and disdain. "I am Rena," she said, her voice cold and clipped. "I have been sent here to serve as your slave." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. Slave? The concept was as alien as the woman standing before him. He had heard whispers of the Seraphians, an advanced and enigmatic race known for their strict societal codes, but he had never imagined he'd come face to face with one, much less under these circumstances. I don't believe in slavery," Ethan stammered, his voice tinged with both disbelief and indignation. "I didn't ask for this, and I sure as hell don't want it." Rena's gaze didn't waver. "It doesn't matter what you want, human. The Council of Elders decreed this as my punishment. I am bound to this place and to you until they deem otherwise." Ethan rubbed his temples, frustration bubbling inside him. "Great. So now I'm some kind of warden?" He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "I don't know what kind of laws your people have, but this isn't how we do things here. You're not my slave. You're free to go." Her laughter was bitter and short. "Free to go where? Your government has been informed. I cannot leave your property, and even if I could, where would I go? I am alone on a primitive world, cut off from my people and my powers." She lifted her chin, the faint glimmer of something metallic encircling her neck catching the fading sunlight. "This device ensures my obedience, though I have no intention of submitting to you or anyone else." Ethan sighed, the weight of the situation sinking in. He had no idea how to navigate this, no script to follow. What did one do when an alien woman was dropped into their life by an intergalactic council? "Look," he said finally, his tone softening, "I don't know what's happened to you, but I'm not going to treat you like a prisoner. You can stay in the guest room, and we'll figure this out together." Rena's posture remained rigid, her eyes narrowing as if trying to decipher his intentions. "Why would you show me kindness? You owe me nothing." "Maybe not," Ethan replied, "but it's the right thing to do." The tension hung between them, thick and almost suffocating. Finally, with a sharp nod, Rena followed him inside. The farmhouse was small and modest, filled with the scent of freshly cut wood and faint traces of engine oil. Rena's sharp gaze roved over every detail, her lips pressing into a thin line as if judging its simplicity. Ethan showed her to the spare room, a space barely larger than a closet, but clean and functional. "It's not much," he admitted, "but it's yours." She didn't respond, stepping inside and closing the door without a word. Ethan stood there for a moment, exhaling heavily before retreating to the kitchen. He poured himself a cup of coffee, his hands shaking slightly. He had no idea what to make of this surreal situation. The logical part of his mind screamed at him to contact someone, anyone, to take her off his hands. But as he recalled the defiance in her eyes, the weight of whatever she had endured etched into her every movement, he couldn't bring himself to make the call. That night, Ethan lay awake, the events of the day replaying in his mind. He wondered about her world, her people, and what she could have done to warrant such a punishment. The answers seemed far out of reach, buried beneath layers of pride and anger she clearly held close. In the room down the hall, Rena sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the small window at the unfamiliar night sky. The stars here were brighter, more scattered than the uniform constellations of Seraphia. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she fought the ache of humiliation. This man, This human had shown her more decency in a single evening than her own kind had in years, and yet it only deepened her resolve to escape. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow she would begin planning her return, no matter what it took. Neither of them knew it then, but this uneasy beginning was the first step toward a bond that would change both their lives forever. Ethan awoke the next morning to the sound of water running in the bathroom and the faint creak of footsteps moving through the house. For a moment he thought everything that had happened the day before was a bizarre dream, but then he remembered her, the sharp edge of her voice, the icy glare that seemed to cut through him. Rena was real, and she was here. When she emerged from the guest room, her posture was as rigid as ever, her silver hair catching the morning light streaming through the windows. Ethan stood by the kitchen counter, holding a cup of coffee and trying not to appear as lost as he felt. "Morning," he said casually, though his voice held an awkward edge. "I wasn't sure if you'd be up yet." "I don't require as much rest as humans," she replied bluntly, her gaze scanning the room. "Your dwelling is primitive." Ethan chuckled, though her tone made it clear she hadn't intended it as a joke. "Yeah, well, it gets the job done." He gestured to the table. "I made breakfast. You're welcome to join me." Rena hesitated, clearly debating whether to accept the offer. Finally, she sat across from him, her movements deliberate and poised, as though trying to maintain some semblance of dignity despite her circumstances. The silence between them was heavy, punctuated only by the occasional clink of utensils. Ethan tried not to stare, but her presence was almost magnetic, even as her expression remained distant and guarded. "So," he ventured, breaking the silence, "what exactly did you do to end up here? I mean, if you don't mind me asking." Her fork paused mid-air, and her violet eyes flicked up to meet his. "I violated the laws of my people," she said simply. "The details are irrelevant." Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Doesn't seem fair to me. Sending someone all the way to another planet as punishment feels extreme." "You wouldn't understand," she replied curtly, her voice carrying a note of finality. Ethan sighed, realizing he wasn't going to get more out of her. Instead, he turned his attention to the tasks of the day. The irrigation system on his farm needed repairs, and he figured keeping busy might help distract both of them from the awkward tension hanging in the air. "Feel free to explore," he said as he grabbed his tools and headed for the door. "Or don't. Up to you." Rena didn't respond, but after a few minutes, she followed him outside, standing at a distance as he knelt to inspect the pipes. The dry earth crunched beneath her feet as she moved closer, her arms crossed and her gaze skeptical. "You do all this by hand?" she asked, her tone carrying a hint of incredulity. Ethan glanced up, wiping sweat from his brow. "Yeah. Machines can only do so much, and hiring help isn't exactly in the budget." She watched him work for a while, her expression unreadable. "It's inefficient," she said finally. "On Seraphia, we have technology to handle such tasks in seconds." "Well, we're not on Seraphia," Ethan replied, a wry smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Here, we make do with what we've got." Rena's eyes narrowed, but she didn't argue. Instead, she crouched down beside him, her movements graceful despite her obvious disdain for the task at hand. "What's the problem?" she asked, her tone begrudgingly curious. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You offering to help?" "Don't misunderstand me," she said sharply. "I'm merely observing." "Uh-huh." Ethan shook his head, hiding a smirk. "Well, the system's clogged. Probably dirt or debris in the main line. If I don't clear it, the crops won't get water." Rena tilted her head, studying the network of pipes and valves as if piecing together a puzzle. Without a word, she reached out and twisted one of the valves. Ethan started to protest, but then he heard the rush of water surging through the system. "There," she said, standing and brushing off her hands. "Primitive, but functional." Ethan stared at her, equal parts impressed and annoyed. "How'd you know how to do that?" She shrugged. "I observed. It wasn't difficult." For the first time since she'd arrived, Ethan saw a flicker of something resembling pride in her expression, and it made him smile despite himself. The days that followed were marked by a cautious truce between them. Rena continued to watch Ethan as he worked, occasionally offering unsolicited advice or criticism. She refused to participate in any task she deemed beneath her, but there were moments when curiosity got the better of her, and she found herself lending a hand. Ethan, for his part, was patient. He sensed that her sharp edges hid deeper wounds, though she gave no indication of what they might be. Every now and then he caught her staring at the control device around her neck, her fingers twitching as if she longed to tear it off. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Ethan sat on the porch, nursing a cold beer. Rena stood nearby, her gaze fixed on the distant hills. "Do you miss it?" he asked suddenly. She didn't look at him. "Miss what?" "Your home, your people." Rena's shoulders tensed, and for a moment Ethan thought she wouldn't answer. But then she spoke, her voice quieter than he'd ever heard it. "Seraphia is perfect. Every aspect of life is controlled, efficient, and flawless. But perfection has its price." She hesitated, her hands clenching at her sides. "There is no room for error, no tolerance for individuality. I questioned that, and I paid the price." Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Sounds like a tough place to live." "It is not your concern," she snapped, though her voice lacked its usual venom. "Maybe not," he said, taking a sip of his beer. "But you're here now, and for what it's worth, I think you're tougher than you give yourself credit for." Rena turned to him, her violet eyes searching his face as if trying to decipher his intentions. She didn't respond, but for the first time she didn't dismiss his words outright. As the stars began to dot the sky, the tension between them eased, replaced by a fragile understanding. Neither of them knew what the future held, but for now they were beginning to find common ground, an uneasy alliance forged in the quiet solitude of the farm. The days on Ethan's farm began to take on a strange rhythm. Rena, though still wary and distant, started to involve herself in the day-to-day work, not out of obligation, but out of curiosity and perhaps boredom. At first she only observed, her sharp comments cutting through the silence as Ethan tinkered with machinery or tended to his crops. But soon her curiosity got the better of her, and she began asking questions. Ethan, patient as ever, answered each one, despite her sometimes condescending tone. One afternoon, as Ethan wrestled with a broken piece of equipment in the barn, Rena stood nearby, arms crossed, watching him struggle. The stubborn engine part refused to budge, and Ethan's frustration was evident in the way he wiped his hands on his jeans, leaving streaks of grease. "Is this what humans call engineering?" she finally asked, her voice laced with disdain. "It looks more like trial and error." Ethan turned to her, his irritation bubbling to the surface. "You think you can do better?" She tilted her head, a small smirk playing at her lips. "I know I can." Without waiting for permission, she stepped forward and knelt beside him. Her movements were precise, her fingers deft as she examined the machine. For a moment, Ethan hesitated, unsure whether to stop her. But then she pressed her palm against the mechanism, closed her eyes, and murmured something under her breath. A faint hum filled the air, and the part snapped into place as if guided by an invisible force. Ethan stared, dumbfounded. "How did you—" "It's simple when you understand the principles," Rena interrupted, standing and brushing her hands off. Her tone was matter-of-fact, but there was a glimmer of satisfaction in her eyes. "Your technology may be primitive, but it's not without its charm." Ethan shook his head, still processing what he'd just witnessed. "You know, for someone who says she's not staying here by choice, you're surprisingly helpful." Rena didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned and walked toward the barn doors, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's better than sitting idly. Besides, your incompetence was starting to irritate me." Despite her words, Ethan caught a fleeting softness in her expression, something that hinted at a deeper shift within her. Over the following weeks, Rena's involvement in the farm's upkeep grew. She still maintained her air of superiority, but there was a quiet eagerness in the way she approached new tasks. Ethan taught her how to harvest crops, repair fences, and even prepare meals, skills she found both menial and strangely satisfying. One evening, as they worked side by side in the kitchen, Rena glanced at Ethan. "Why do you do all of this?" "All of what?" "This existence. Farming, fixing machines, living in isolation. It seems so inefficient." Ethan shrugged, chopping vegetables with practiced ease. "It's not about efficiency. It's about independence. Out here, I don't have to rely on anyone else. It's hard work, sure, but there's something honest about it." Rena frowned, her hands pausing mid-motion. "Honest," she repeated, the word tasting foreign on her tongue. "That's not a concept we value on Seraphia. Efficiency and perfection are all that matter." "Well, maybe that's the problem," Ethan said, his tone light but his words pointed. "Maybe perfection isn't all it's cracked up to be." For once, Rena didn't argue. Instead, she focused on her task, her thoughts swirling with unfamiliar questions. Their uneasy alliance began to evolve into something resembling camaraderie. They worked together to rebuild the irrigation system, their combined efforts yielding results that neither could have achieved alone. Rena's sharp intellect and Ethan's practical know-how complemented each other in ways that surprised them both. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch after a long day, Ethan handed Rena a glass of iced tea. She accepted it without comment, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "You're different than I expected," Ethan said, breaking the silence. Rena raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" "When you first got here, I thought you'd be, I don't know, impossible to deal with. But you're not. You're stubborn, sure, but you're also smart. And, believe it or not, you're not half bad company." Rena's lips twitched, as if she were suppressing a smile. "That's the closest thing to a compliment I've heard from you, human." "It's Ethan," he corrected gently. "Not human. Just Ethan." For the first time, Rena's expression softened, and she nodded. "Ethan," she said, the name unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. As their bond deepened, Rena began to open up about her life on Seraphia. She spoke of the rigid structure of her society, the suffocating expectations, and the council's unyielding authority. Ethan listened intently, his empathy shining through in the way he asked questions and offered quiet reassurances. One night, as they sat beneath a sky filled with stars, Rena confessed something that surprised even herself. "I always thought Earth was inferior, that humans were primitive and driven by chaos. But now, I'm not so sure." Ethan glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "What changed your mind?" "You did," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your kindness, your honesty. It's something we lack on Seraphia. I didn't realize how much I was missing it until now." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Ethan didn't respond immediately, but when he did, his voice was soft and steady. "I think you're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Rena. You don't need perfection to be whole. You just need to be yourself." In that moment, Rena felt a flicker of something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. For the first time, she began to wonder if her exile wasn't a punishment after all, but an opportunity to find a life she never knew she needed. The storm began on a quiet morning, the kind where the stillness seemed too perfect to last. Rena stood by the kitchen window, staring at the sky with a distant look. Something in the air felt off, an unease she couldn't shake. Ethan, busy fixing a squeaky cabinet door, didn't notice her tension at first. "Do you ever think about what happens if they come back for you?" Ethan asked suddenly, his voice casual but carrying an undertone of concern. Rena's shoulders stiffened. "The council?" she said, her voice quieter than usual. "They wouldn't bother. They think exile is enough." Ethan nodded. though he didn't seem convinced. I don't know. People with power don't usually let things go so easily. Before Rena could respond, a low hum filled the air. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, reverberating through the walls. Rena's eyes widened, and she instinctively stepped back from the window. "They're here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan froze, the screwdriver in his hand clattering to the floor. "Who's here?" "The Seraphians," Rena replied, her tone sharper now. "The council wouldn't send a delegation unless they wanted to make a statement." They rushed outside just as a sleek Seraphian ship descended, its crystalline hull shimmering ominously in the sunlight. The air was thick with tension as the ship landed in the field. A ramp extended, and 3 figures emerged, their flowing robes and glowing eyes marking them as enforcers of the council's will. The lead Seraphian, taller and more imposing than the others, stepped forward. His voice boomed, commanding attention. "Rena of Seraphia, you are summoned to answer for your continued defiance. Your exile is not a reprieve. It is a lesson you have yet to learn." Ethan stepped in front of Rena instinctively, his posture protective. "She's not going anywhere," he said, his voice firm. The Seraphian's gaze shifted to Ethan, his expression a mix of curiosity and disdain. "A human speaks for her? How quaint. You have no authority here." Ethan's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Rena placed a hand on his arm. "Ethan, stop," she said softly, though her tone carried an urgency he couldn't ignore. "No," Ethan shot back. "You don't have to go with them. Not like this." Rena's violet eyes met his, filled with both gratitude and a deep sadness. "You don't understand. They won't stop until they get what they want. Fighting them will only make things worse." The lead Seraphian raised a hand, a small device glowing in his palm. The control device around Rena's neck began to pulse, and she winced, dropping to one knee as the energy surged through her. "Stop it!" Ethan shouted, stepping toward the Seraphian. "You would dare interfere?" the enforcer sneered. Ethan didn't hesitate. He lunged, grabbing the device from the Seraphian's hand and throwing it to the ground. The other 2 enforcers moved to restrain him, but Rena, now free from the control device's influence, sprang into action. Her restored strength was a force to behold. With a single motion, she disabled one enforcer with a surge of energy, his weapon clattering to the ground. The second hesitated, clearly unprepared for the resistance. "Enough," the lead Seraphian barked, his voice reverberating like thunder. "You think you can defy the council's will and live to tell of it. You are a fool, Rena, and this human is nothing more than collateral damage in your rebellion." Rena straightened, her expression fierce and unyielding. "You're wrong. He's not collateral damage. He's the reason I found my strength again, and I will not let you take that away from me." The enforcer sneered, raising a hand to summon a surge of energy, but Ethan stepped in front of Rena, shielding her with his own body. "If you want her, you'll have to go through me," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. The Seraphian hesitated, clearly taken aback by Ethan's defiance. Rena seized the moment, channeling her energy into a focused blast that knocked the enforcers off balance. "Let's go," she urged, grabbing Ethan's arm and pulling him toward the barn. Inside, she worked quickly, using what little Seraphian technology she had managed to piece together over the past weeks. Ethan watched her, his mind racing. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice tinged with both urgency and confusion. "Stalling," Rena replied, her hands moving deftly over the device. "They won't stop until they have me, but if I can disable their ship, we might have a chance." Ethan nodded, trusting her despite the chaos unfolding around them. Outside, the enforcers regrouped, their frustration evident as they approached the barn. The lead Seraphian's voice echoed, laced with fury. "You cannot hide, Rena. Surrender now, and perhaps we will show mercy." Rena's fingers stilled, and she glanced at Ethan. "If this doesn't work—" "It will," he interrupted, his tone resolute. "And if it doesn't, we'll figure something else out. Together." Her gaze softened, and for a brief moment, The chaos seemed to fade. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The device in her hands sparked to life, and a low hum filled the air. Outside, the Seraphian ship shuddered as its systems began to fail. "What have you done?" the lead enforcer roared, his voice carrying a mix of anger and disbelief. Rena stepped out of the barn, Ethan close behind. Her posture was defiant, her voice steady. "I've made my choice. I will not return to Seraphia. I will not live under your rules any more." The enforcer's eyes narrowed, his expression dark. "You have sealed your fate, Rena." Rena met his gaze without flinching. "Maybe, but at least it's mine to seal." As the enforcers retreated to their disabled ship, their anger palpable, Ethan and Rena stood side by side, the tension between them replaced by an unspoken bond. "Is it over?" Ethan asked, his voice cautious. "For now," Rena replied, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "But they'll be back." Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch grounding her. "Then we'll be ready." Rena turned to him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. For the first time, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: hope. Together they returned to the farmhouse, the bond between them stronger than ever, ready to face whatever came next. The aftermath of the confrontation left the farm in an uneasy quiet. The Seraphian ship remained grounded in the far field, its once pristine surface dull and lifeless. Rena stood at the edge of the porch, staring at the distant vessel. The sun was beginning to set, and the long shadows of the wreck seemed to stretch endlessly across the landscape. Ethan joined her, his hands in his pockets, his presence steady and calming. "You think they'll fix it?" he asked after a long silence. "They'll try," Rena replied. Her voice was softer now, devoid of the sharpness that had once defined it. "But the damage will take time to repair, enough time for us to figure out what to do next." Ethan leaned against the porch railing, his eyes on her. "What's next, Rena? You're free now, but they're not going to just let you go." Rena's gaze didn't waver from the horizon. "No, they won't. But I'm not the same person they exiled. I've learned things here, things they fear. They think they control everything, but they've forgotten what it means to adapt, to grow." Her words carried a conviction that Ethan hadn't heard before. He could see the change in her, the way she held herself differently now, no longer a prisoner bound by the rules of her old life. It was a quiet strength, one that had been forged in the weeks she had spent with him, learning and unlearning what it meant to exist outside the rigid confines of her people's laws. "You're planning to go back, aren't you?" he asked, his tone heavy. Rena finally turned to him, her violet eyes meeting his. "I have to. Not for them, but for me. I need them to see what I've seen, to understand that their way isn't the only way." Ethan nodded slowly, though the thought of her leaving made his chest tighten. "And if they don't listen?" "Then I'll still have tried," she said simply. "That's more than most Seraphians ever do." The next morning, Rena set to work dismantling parts of the disabled Seraphian ship. She salvaged pieces she could use, piecing together a communication device that would allow her to contact the council. Ethan helped her where he could, though he avoided asking too many questions. He knew she needed to focus, and truthfully, he wasn't ready to hear the answers. By evening, the device was complete. Rena activated it, her fingers steady despite the weight of what she was about to do. A faint glow filled the room as the device powered on, and a distorted voice crackled to life. "This is Rena of Seraphia," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I request an audience with the council." There was a pause, then a response, cold and unyielding. "You have defied our laws, Rena. Why should we grant you anything?" "Because I have something you need," she replied without hesitation. "A perspective you lack. You can summon me, or I can make my case to the entire galaxy. Your choice." The line went silent, and for a moment, Ethan thought they might ignore her. But then the voice returned, clipped and begrudging. "Very well. A transport will arrive shortly." The transport ship descended at dawn, its crystalline surface gleaming in the light. Rena and Ethan stood side by side, their belongings packed into a small bag at their feet. The moment felt surreal, as if they were on the edge of something neither fully understood. "You don't have to come," Rena said, her voice softer now. "This isn't your fight." Ethan shook his head. "It is now. You're not facing them alone." The transport carried them to Sarafia, the journey quiet and tense. Ethan watched Rena closely, searching for any signs of doubt, but she remained composed, her gaze fixed ahead. When they arrived, the familiar crystal towers of her home loomed in the distance, their cold beauty a stark contrast to the warmth of Earth. The council chambers were just as imposing as Rena remembered, the towering figures of the elders seated in a semicircle of authority. Their glowing eyes bore into her as she entered, Ethan close behind. The tension in the room was palpable, the weight of their judgment pressing down like a physical force. "Rena of Sarafia," the head elder intoned, his voice resonating through the chamber. "You return to us in defiance. Explain yourself." Rena stepped forward, her posture straight and unwavering. "I return not in defiance, but in truth. You exiled me because I questioned your ways, because I dared to seek knowledge beyond what you deem acceptable. But in my exile, I have learned what you refuse to see. There is strength in imperfection, wisdom in chaos. The rigidity of our society is not a mark of superiority, it is a weakness." The murmurs that spread through the chamber were immediate, a ripple of shock and discontent. The head elder's gaze darkened. "You speak of wisdom, yet you consort with a lesser species. This human, why is he here?" Ethan stepped forward before Rena could respond, his voice steady. "I'm here because she asked me to be, because I've seen who she really is, someone brave enough to challenge the status quo, to fight for something better. If that makes her a threat to you, maybe it's time to ask why." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling like a stone. The elders exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from skepticism to contemplation. For the first time, Rena saw hesitation in their eyes, cracks in the facade of their unshakable authority. "You claim to bring wisdom," the head elder said finally, "but words alone cannot change the fabric of our society." Rena nodded. "I understand that, but the seeds of change are already planted. Others like me will question, will seek more. You can suppress us, or you can evolve." The chamber fell into a tense quiet, the elders retreating to deliberate. When they returned, their decision was measured but clear. "You will not face further punishment, Rena of Sarafia, but your actions have consequences. You are free to leave, but you may never return." Rena bowed her head, accepting their decree. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling within her. As they left the chambers, Ethan reached for her hand, his grip reassuring. "You did it," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "It's not over," she replied, though there was a note of relief in her tone. "But it's a start." Together they stepped into the light of a new day, ready to face whatever came next. Together,